Celeste Carr, a black woman in a small, corrupt town, confronts a system rigged against her and others like her. When Officer Daniels, a racist cop, is exposed for his role in manipulating the law to discriminate against black residents, Celeste's fight for justice takes center stage. As she uncovers deep-seated corruption, she faces constant opposition from those in power, including a town mayor complicit in Daniels' actions. Celeste's struggle highlights the pervasive racial biases that permeate every level of authority, showing how systemic racism destroys lives and prevents true justice from taking root. The soft hum of an engine broke the morning stillness as a sleek black luxury SUV pulled into a gravel parking lot. A light drizzle misted the windshield, and the driver, a poised woman in her early 40s, adjusted her sunglasses before stepping out. Dr. Celeste Carr was a woman of quiet power. Her face, framed by dark curls and streaks of silver, reflected calm and focus. She'd built a reputation not just as one of the country's leading cardiothoracic surgeons, but as a force for change. In headlines and interviews, Celeste's name carried weight. Donations to underserved hospitals, scholarship programs for young black medical students, and advocacy for equitable healthcare. Yet, in this small, overlooked southern town of Chester Hill, titles meant little, and reputations could be erased with a single look. The town was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Its charm was easy to spot: aged red brick buildings, white picket fences, and tidy shops with hand-painted signs. But beneath the picture-perfect facade was a weight, a heavy, unspoken tension that pressed down on anyone who didn't quite belong. Celeste noticed it as soon as she arrived: the fleeting glances, the murmurs, the way people's smiles held just a little too long, as though covering something else entirely. She was here on personal business, a matter tied to her late grandmother's estate, a small house Celeste had kept untouched out of sentimentality. While her firm handshake and polished demeanor made her presence impossible to ignore, she chose not to broadcast who she was. Celeste had learned long ago that power was most effective when wielded quietly. On this particular morning, she found herself craving familiarity. She parked outside a modest diner on Main Street, a place she remembered visiting as a child with her grandmother. The sign above the door read, "Marge's Kitchen," its lettering cracked and weather-worn. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and decades of memories baked into the walls. Celeste stepped inside, the brass bell above the door jingling. Heads turned, just for a moment, before most of the patrons returned to their breakfast plates and whispered conversations. The diner was full of the usual crowd: farmers in overalls, young men with dusty boots, and a few retirees nursing their second or third cups of coffee. Behind the counter, a plump older woman with faded red curls smiled warmly as Celeste approached. "Morning," the woman said. "Just you today?" "Just me," Celeste replied, offering a polite smile. "Take a seat anywhere you like. I'll get you a menu." Celeste chose a booth near the window, where streaks of rain trickled down the glass, like tiny rivers. From her seat, she could see the old courthouse across the street. A building she'd been avoiding. Paperwork for her grandmother's estate was waiting, tangled up in bureaucracy, but something about Chester Hill's halls of justice made her stomach knot. The waitress returned with a menu and a steaming mug of coffee. "What brings you to town, sweetheart? Passing through?" "Something like that," Celeste said, stirring sugar into her coffee. It wasn't unkind curiosity, just the kind of question small-town folks asked to place a stranger in their world. "Well, holler if you need anything. We've got the best biscuits in 3 counties." She winked and shuffled off. Celeste sipped her coffee and let the small-town hum surround her. It wasn't unpleasant: the soft clink of utensils, the distant hum of a country song playing on the radio, the chatter of the regulars. It reminded her of mornings spent at her grandmother's kitchen table, simpler times when the world seemed smaller and more forgiving. That's when the front door opened again, and the atmosphere shifted. A tall man in a pressed sheriff's uniform strode in, his boots thudding against the floorboards. He had a square jaw, close-cropped blonde hair, and a sharp gaze that cut through the room. He greeted the counter waitress with a familiarity that bordered on arrogance before his eyes scanned the diner. Celeste caught the flicker of hesitation when his gaze landed on her. It was the smallest thing, a moment of narrowing focus, but she noticed Years of working in life-or-death surgeries had sharpened her ability to read people, to anticipate danger before it arrived. She sipped her coffee, letting her expression remain unreadable as the sheriff approached. "Mornin'," he said, coming to a stop beside her table. "Good morning," Celeste replied evenly, not looking up. The sheriff waited, as though expecting her to offer more. When she didn't, he cleared his throat. "Don't think I've seen you around here before?" "I'm just visiting," she replied, meeting his gaze this time. The polite veneer in her voice never wavered, but her eyes were sharp. She could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to place her. "You got family here?" he pressed. "I do. My grandmother passed recently." "That so?" His tone remained conversational, but something about it made the words sit wrong. "Sorry to hear that. What's her name?" Celeste's grip on the mug tightened. She had a strong suspicion this wasn't idle curiosity, but she answered anyway. "Ruth Carr." "Ruth Carr?" The sheriff's expression turned thoughtful. "I knew Ruth, good woman, quiet." Celeste nodded, unsure how to respond. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation, a reminder that Ruth had stayed in her lane. The sheriff seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary, studying her. Finally, he adjusted his belt and offered a thin smile. "Well, you enjoy your breakfast. Small town like this, people notice strangers. Just be careful, all right?" "Careful of what?" Celeste asked, her tone neutral. He shrugged. "Nothing in particular. Just saying. It's easy to stand out." Celeste watched as he turned and walked back toward the counter, greeting a couple of older men as though nothing had happened. Her shoulders tensed, but she forced herself to remain calm. It wasn't the words he'd chosen that bothered her, but the way he said them. It was the subtle implication behind his smile, the same one she'd seen time and time again, a reminder that she didn't quite belong. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. A lifetime of breaking through barriers, of being the only black woman in a boardroom, an operating room, or a conference stage, had prepared her for moments like this, moments where people tried to shrink her, but this wasn't over. The way the sheriff had looked at her, the weight of the silence in the diner when he spoke, it felt like a warning. Chester Hill wasn't just watching her, it was waiting to see what she'd do next. Celeste finished her coffee in silence, the sheriff's words lingering like a stain. She knew his type, men who wore authority like a second skin, twisting it into something sharp and suffocating. As he laughed with the waitress behind the counter, it was clear the sheriff wasn't in any rush to leave. He wanted her to know he was watching, and he wanted her to feel it. Celeste turned her attention to the window, watching raindrops trace lines across the glass. For a moment, she considered leaving, but something in her refused to budge. She'd spent decades proving people like him wrong, refusing to let their suspicion or condescension shrink her world. So she sat still, took her time finishing breakfast, and waited for the moment to pass. When she finally stood to leave, the room seemed to track her movements. The waitress gave a small wave, though the warmth in her earlier smile had cooled. Outside, the air was thick with damp humidity as Celeste crossed the street toward the old courthouse. The building hadn't changed in decades. Its faded white columns and cracked marble steps stood as a testament to time, while the people who moved through its halls carried the weight of more invisible traditions. She climbed the steps, her shoes clicking against the stone, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the courthouse was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of hush that greeted outsiders like a locked door. A receptionist sat behind a glass window, a small sign reading Clerk of Records pinned to the wall behind her. The woman looked up as Celeste approached, her eyes flickering over her appearance, polished but understated, a tailored navy coat, and a leather bag hanging at her side. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice clipped. "I'm here for some paperwork regarding Ruth Carr's estate," Celeste said evenly. "The records office was supposed to finalize things." The woman's brows furrowed as if Celeste had spoken in a foreign language. "Name?" "Dr. Celeste Carr." The woman's lips twitched slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "Doctor?" "Yes, doctor." The receptionist didn't respond. She shuffled a few papers on her desk, clicking through a slow, deliberate search on her computer. "We're short-staffed today," she said, her tone flat. "It might take a while." "That's fine, I'll wait." The woman glanced up, almost startled that Celeste wasn't backing down. "You can take a seat." Celeste moved to a row of worn chairs, sinking into one with a sigh. A wall clock ticked loudly overhead, marking every slow second. People came and went, a young man paying a parking ticket, an older woman filing for permits, but the receptionist made no move to call Celeste back to the window. Every now and then, she glanced in Celeste's direction with a carefully blank expression. Half an hour passed. Then an hour. Celeste shifted in her seat, her patience thinning. She approached the window again, offering a measured smile. "Any progress?" The receptionist sighed dramatically, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I told you we're short-staffed. These things take time." "Understood," Celeste replied, her voice calm but pointed. "It's just that I called ahead. The paperwork was supposed to be ready for pickup." "I don't know what to tell you." Celeste exhaled through her nose, steadying herself. She was familiar with this dance. The slow grind of bureaucracy turned personal, the invisible wall that was always there, even when no one admitted to building it. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Celeste said evenly. The receptionist's eyes narrowed, her pleasant veneer cracking. "My supervisor is busy. You're welcome to leave your number." "I'll wait." The woman looked ready to argue, but something in Celeste's tone silenced her. With a huff, she pushed her chair back and disappeared into the hallway beyond the glass. The minutes dragged on. Celeste's fingers tapped against her bag as she fought the frustration threatening to boil over. She wasn't new to this feeling, being made to wait, to justify her existence, as though her very presence demanded explanation. It was exhausting, but letting it break her wasn't an option. A door creaked open, and a heavy-set man in a rumpled shirt and tie appeared. His badge read, "George Duffy, head clerk." He offered Celeste a glance that teetered between polite and dismissive. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Celeste replied. "I'm here to finalize some paperwork for Ruth Carr's estate. I was told it would be ready." The man frowned, tugging at the collar of his shirt. "Ah, Ruth Carr. That's a complicated case." "Complicated how?" "Look, these things take time, especially when there's confusion about ownership and documentation." "There's no confusion," Celeste replied firmly. "The deed and all related documents are in order. I submitted everything weeks ago." Duffy shifted his weight, his expression slipping into something resembling pity. "Sometimes folks think they have everything sorted, but, well, old properties like this?" Celeste's jaw tightened. She knew what he was implying. "Are you suggesting I don't have a legal claim?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Duffy said, holding up a placating hand. "I'm just saying these things aren't always straightforward. You'd be surprised how often people come in claiming things that don't belong to them." Celeste's patience snapped. "Is that what you think this is?" Now, Duffy said quickly, his hands raising in mock surrender. "I'm not saying that, but you have to understand. We're careful about these things. It's our job to make sure everything checks out." "And how long do you plan on dragging this out?" Duffy's face darkened slightly, the mask slipping. "No one's dragging anything out, but if you've got concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. Until then, there's nothing else to discuss." Celeste stared at him, her pulse quickening with anger. The man was dismissing her, brushing her off like a stain on his tie, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. She forced her voice to remain steady. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said coldly, "and I expect this to be resolved." Duffy gave a non-committal grunt and turned back toward the hallway, leaving her standing there. Celeste collected her bag and strode out of the courthouse, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. Outside, the drizzle had turned to steady rain, and the weight in her chest grew heavier with every step. She climbed into her SUV, shutting the door a little too hard. For a moment, she sat still, gripping the wheel as the events of the morning replayed in her mind. It was infuriating, how easily they dismissed her, how quickly they assumed she didn't belong. She'd spent her life fighting to be seen, to carve out a place where no one could question her worth. And yet, here she was again, reduced to nothing more than an outsider, with a claim they refused to recognize. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, breaking her spiral of thought. She picked it up and saw a text from Sarah, her best friend and longtime confidant. Heard you're back in town. Everything okay? Celeste stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Not yet, but it will be. She set the phone down and started the engine. Her reflection in the rearview mirror caught her eye, calm, composed, but with a fire burning behind it. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Whatever game they were playing in Chester Hill, Celeste wasn't about to lose. The rain had settled into a steady downpour as Celeste parked in front of her grandmother's property later that afternoon. The house sat like a memory, weathered but proud, the paint peeling around the edges and the shutters creaking softly in the wind. Her grandmother had built a life here, stubbornly staying when others moved away, rooted in a community that had never fully embraced her. Celeste stepped out of the SUV, shielding herself with her coat as she climbed the worn steps to the porch. She'd barely slipped her key into the lock when the sound of tires crunching gravel made her pause. She turned and saw a patrol car pulling in behind her. The sheriff stepped out, his uniform now damp from the rain. Officer Holt followed closely behind, his face stony. Together, they made their way up the driveway with deliberate strides, boots sinking into the mud. Celeste's pulse quickened, but she held her ground, her expression calm. "Afternoon, Doctor," Sheriff Holt said, his tone casual in a way that felt rehearsed. "Something I can help you with, Sheriff?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, flipping it open and holding it out. "We've got a warrant to search the property." Celeste's brows furrowed. "Search for what?" "There's been a report of stolen items, antiques specifically, linked to this address. Couple of folks claim they saw suspicious activity here over the past few weeks." The accusation hit her like a slap. Suspicious activity? She glanced between the two men, searching their faces for answers. "You can't be serious." "Just doing our jobs," the sheriff replied smoothly. "We've got cause to search, so step aside. You're not stepping foot in this house." "Ma'am," Officer Holt said, his voice taking on a practiced sternness, "you can either cooperate, or we can do this the hard way." "This is harassment," Celeste shot back, her voice low and sharp. "You know it, and I know it. What exactly are you hoping to find?" The sheriff's smirk widened, just a fraction. "That depends. Got anything you don't want us to see?" Celeste's fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream at them, to let loose the rage burning in her chest, but she knew that wouldn't help. Not here, not now. Men like this fed on anger. They wanted her to lose control. Instead, she drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'll be contacting my attorney." "You do that?" Holt said, brushing past her with deliberate indifference. The sheriff followed, the two of them forcing their way through the door like they owned the place. Celeste stood frozen for a moment before she turned and marched inside after them. They moved through the house like wolves, rifling through cabinets, opening drawers, and turning over boxes as though they expected contraband to fall out of thin air. Celeste watched them in silence, her heart pounding as she struggled to keep her composure. "You think this is funny?" she said finally, her voice cutting through the chaos. The sheriff looked up from a cabinet he'd just slammed shut. "I don't think anything, ma'am. I'm just looking for answers." "You're not looking for answers. You're looking for an excuse. You're looking for a reason to put me in my place." Holt snorted softly, shaking his head. "You need to calm down." "Calm down?" Celeste took a step closer, her words measured, but ice cold. "You came to my home. You accused me of theft without proof. You're tearing apart my family's property for no reason other than the color of my skin. So tell me, Sheriff, how exactly do you expect me to calm down?" Before either man could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. All three turned to see a man in his mid-30s standing hesitantly in the doorway, dripping wet from the rain. It was Mitchell, one of Celeste's few remaining allies in Chester Hill. A junior officer who'd grown up in town, Mitchell had always been polite in their brief encounters, soft-spoken, with a look of perpetual unease, as though constantly weighing his place in the system. "Sheriff," Mitchell said cautiously, his eyes flickering toward Celeste before back to his superior, "I think we need to call this off." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Excuse me?" "We've got no solid leads," Mitchell continued, his voice shaking slightly. "This doesn't feel right." "You don't decide when we're done," the sheriff growled. "We're following procedure." "This isn't procedure," Celeste cut in, stepping forward. "It's intimidation, and you know it." Mitchell swallowed hard, looking between the three of them. "Sheriff, maybe we should step outside." "You're out of line, officer," Holt barked. "Get back to the car." Mitchell hesitated, his shoulders slumping as he turned and disappeared into the rain. The momentary disruption had done nothing to stop the search. "This is a mistake," Celeste said quietly, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "Whatever you think you're going to find, you won't." The sheriff ignored her. Minutes dragged by like hours as they tore through every corner of the house. Finally, Holt emerged from a back room, holding something small and gleaming in his hand. Celeste's stomach dropped as she recognized it, a silver pocket watch her grandfather had owned, its chain dangling loosely between Holt's fingers. "Would you look at that?" Holt said, his voice oozing satisfaction. "Found this tucked under a floorboard. Looks like someone's been hiding stolen goods." Celeste's blood ran cold. "That's my grandfather's watch." "Maybe," Holt replied with a shrug. "But it matches the description of one of the stolen antiques." Celeste felt the walls close in, her mind racing. It was impossible that watch had been in the same spot for decades, untouched and forgotten until now. They'd planted it. She knew it. They all knew it. But there was nothing she could do. The sheriff clapped Holt on the shoulder, smiling like a man who'd won a game. "Looks like we'll need you to come down to the station, doctor, just to clear things up." "This is a setup," Celeste said, her voice shaking now, the fury breaking through her calm. "You can't do this." "Oh, we can," Holt replied. "And we are." Celeste's breath came fast and shallow as they moved toward her, hands twitching toward their cuffs. Every instinct in her screamed to fight back, to resist, to do something. But she knew how that would end. So she stood still, her back straight and her chin lifted, even as Holt took her arm with unnecessary force and led her toward the door. Outside, the rain poured harder, drenching her as they guided her down the steps. Across the street, people had gathered, neighbors and strangers alike, their faces pressed against windows or hidden under umbrellas, watching, always watching. Mitchell was by the patrol car, his face pale as he opened the back door. He looked at Celeste, really looked at her, and she could see the shame written across his expression. "I'm sorry," he muttered, as she was guided into the car. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The anger and humiliation choked her, sitting heavy in her chest like a stone. As the door slammed shut behind her, Celeste stared out the window at the blurred outlines of Chester Hill. The town had always been small, but now it felt suffocating, a cage made of old grudges and unchecked power. But as the car pulled away, something hardened inside her. This wasn't over. The ride to the station was silent, save for the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers as they fought against the downpour. Celeste sat rigid in the back seat, her wrists burning where the cold handcuffs pinched her skin. Her mind was a storm of fury and disbelief, but her expression remained impassive, fixed on the blurred outlines of Chester Hill through the rain-streaked window. They planted that watch. She knew it like she knew her own name, but proving it would be another matter. The sheriff and Holt had played their hand perfectly, executing their little performance with precision. They didn't just want her arrested, they wanted her humiliated, and as much as it burned, Celeste knew they weren't done yet. The station loomed ahead, small and unassuming, a red brick building with a cracked sign that read, "Chester Hill Police Department Officer Holt," parked the car around the back, out of sight, as though Celeste's presence were a stain they didn't want the town to see. When the door opened, the rain hit her like a wall. Holt grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly, and guided her inside. She straightened her spine as she walked through the doorway, refusing to let them see even a flicker of weakness. If they wanted a show, she wouldn't give it to them. Inside, the station buzzed with low murmurs and the hum of old fluorescent lights. A couple of officers glanced up as Holt escorted her through the main room. One smirked. Another looked away, uncomfortable. None of them spoke. Sheriff Holt was already waiting for her in a small, windowless interrogation room. He stood beside a dented metal table, the same smug expression plastered across his face. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the lone chair. Celeste's gaze cut through him like glass, but she didn't speak. She sat, slowly and deliberately, refusing to be rushed. Holt remained standing, letting the silence stretch until it became oppressive. "Dr. Carr," he finally said, his tone dripping with faux politeness, "I suppose you know why you're here." Celeste arched an eyebrow, her voice steady. "I'd love to hear your explanation." Holt grinned as he dropped the silver pocket watch onto the table. It landed with a clatter, the sound echoing through the room. "You know what this is?" "It's my grandfather's watch," Celeste replied evenly. "And it's been in that house since before I was born. You planted it." Holt chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a bold accusation, Doctor, but I think the evidence speaks for itself." He crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Reports of stolen antiques, suspicious activity around the property, and then, lo and behold, we find something that shouldn't be there." Celeste's jaw tightened. "You're making this up." Holt ignored her, his smirk widening. "The truth is, you don't belong here. I don't care how much money you've got, what kind of degrees you're flashing around folks like you waltz into small towns like this, thinking you can take whatever you want. Well, Chester Hill isn't for sale." The words hit her harder than any punch. "Folks like you." The implication was as clear as day, each syllable soaked in venom. Celeste's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but she kept her voice calm, measured. "You don't get to decide who belongs," she said coldly. "You think you're some kind of gatekeeper, protecting this town. You're not. You're a coward hiding behind a badge." Holt's face darkened, the smugness evaporating in an instant. He slammed his palm against the table, the sharp sound jolting through the room. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Celeste shot back, meeting his glare without flinching. "You'll frame me again. Rough me up in the back room. Go ahead, Sheriff. Show me just how far you're willing to go." For a moment, she thought he might actually snap, his fingers twitching at his sides. But then the door opened, breaking the tension. Officer Mitchell stood in the doorway, looking pale and uncertain. "Holt," Mitchell said quietly, his eyes darting to Celeste before back to the sheriff. "You should come out here for a second." Holt scowled. "What is it?" "Just come out," Mitchell insisted. There was something in his voice, an urgency that couldn't be ignored. With a glare in Celeste's direction, Holt pushed off the wall and stalked out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Mitchell lingered for half a second, his gaze flicking to Celeste. "Are you okay?" he muttered under his breath. Celeste nodded stiffly. "You know this is wrong." Mitchell's face flushed, his eyes dropping to the floor. I'm trying." "Try harder," she said, her voice low but firm. "The world doesn't change when good men look the other way." Before he could respond, Holt's angry voice echoed from the hallway outside, followed by another officer speaking too quietly for Celeste to hear. Mitchell shot her one last look, then stepped out and pulled the door shut. Alone in the room, Celeste inhaled deeply, letting the fury simmer beneath her calm exterior. She knew what was happening here. They were trying to make an example of her, a black woman, with wealth and status, who refused to bow her head, but she wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Her mind raced. She needed to get out of this station, and she needed to gather every resource she had to expose these men for what they were. Stay calm. Stay focused. She repeated the words like a mantra. The door opened again, this time to Officer Holt and the sheriff returning. Holt looked angrier than before, his jaw tight. "You're lucky, Dr. Carr. We've got some conflicting reports coming in." "Oh?" Celeste said coolly. "You mean someone's telling the truth?" Holt ignored her, tossing her bag onto the table. "You're free to go for now, but don't get comfortable. You might have fooled a few people in this town, but I'm not one of them." Celeste stood slowly, keeping her movements deliberate as she grabbed her bag. She met Holt's glare head-on. "You think this is over?" she said quietly. "You're wrong. I'm not done with you. Not by a long shot." The sheriff said nothing as she walked out, his silence heavy with unspoken threats. Mitchell was waiting just outside the door, his expression conflicted. "They'll come for you too," Celeste said softly as she passed him. "You need to decide whose side you're really on." The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle as Celeste stepped into the parking lot. Her SUV sat where she'd left it, rainwater pooling around the tires. She climbed inside, shutting the door and resting her forehead against the steering wheel for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over her. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out, seeing Sarah's name flash across the screen. Celeste answered, her voice calm despite everything. "You're not going to believe what just happened." "I might," Sarah replied grimly. "I've been digging since you called this morning. Turns out our friend the sheriff has a history. A few quiet lawsuits filed by people of color, all settled out of court, and he's not the only one. This whole department stinks." Celeste straightened, her eyes narrowing. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Sarah said. "But here's the kicker. There's a paper trail, mismanaged funds, falsified reports, and some interesting real estate deals involving your family's land." Celeste's blood ran cold. "They're trying to take the property." "It looks that way," Sarah confirmed. "They think they can scare you off and take it for themselves. If you hadn't come back, they probably would have succeeded." Celeste gripped the phone tightly, her resolve hardening. "Not a chance in hell." "What are you going to do?" Celeste's voice was steel. "I'm going to fight, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees exactly what's been happening here." The town hall meeting was packed. Every folding chair had been filled, leaving dozens of people to stand along the back wall. Rain-soaked jackets dripped onto the tile floors as whispers buzzed through the room like bees. Low and anxious, the sound of a community waiting for something to break. Celeste stood in the center of the room, her head high, her spine straight. She was flanked by Sarah on one side, laptop clutched tightly against her chest, and Mitchell on the other, his expression grim but resolute. Across from her, seated at the raised platform that overlooked the meeting hall, were Sheriff Holt, the mayor, and a scattering of council members, figures who held the strings of power in Chester Hill. Holt sat with his arms crossed, his smirk barely contained, while the mayor, a wiry man in his 50s, fidgeted nervously with his cufflinks. "This is an open forum, Dr. Carr," the mayor said, his voice thin and forced. "We understand you have concerns, but I hope we can keep this discussion civil." Celeste stepped forward, the murmur of the crowd quieting as she turned to face them. She let the silence stretch just long enough to gather their attention before speaking, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Civility, Mr. Mayor, is exactly what's been denied to me and my family for generations. My grandfather built his life in this town. He worked, he paid his taxes, and he cared for his neighbors. And yet, when I returned here, a woman who's earned everything she has through sweat and sacrifice, your sheriff accused me of being a thief." The crowd shifted uneasily, a few scattered gasps breaking through the tension. "Those accusations didn't come from evidence," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "They came from prejudice, a narrative spun to intimidate me, to humiliate me, and to strip my family of what little remains, and I have the proof." Sarah moved quickly, connecting her laptop to a projector that cast her screen onto the wall behind Celeste. On the display were documents, spreadsheets, and photographs, evidence of mismanaged funds, quiet real estate deals, and the sheriff's hidden history of lawsuits. "The sheriff's office," Celeste said, turning her sharp gaze toward Holt, "has spent years targeting black families, pushing them out under the guise of suspicion, of suspicious activity. Why? Because this land is valuable, and they want it. Families were harassed until they sold their homes for pennies on the dollar. Properties that conveniently ended up in the hands of men like Sheriff Holt's associates." A rumble of voices swept through the crowd, louder this time. Some looked stunned. Others, especially the older residents, avoided her gaze altogether. But Holt was furious. "That's enough," he snapped, slamming his hands against the arm of his chair as he rose. The mayor flinched beside him, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Celeste fired back. "Here's one of the real estate deals made through a shell company tied to your brother-in-law." Sarah clicked a button, pulling up a document with Holt's name circled. "And here," Celeste continued, "is the list of complaints filed by families who were targeted under your investigations. Families who, after months of threats and harassment, were forced to leave Chester Hill." "You're twisting this," Holt barked, his face red. "Those were criminals." "Were they?" Celeste interrupted, stepping closer. "Or were they families who didn't fit into the version of Chester Hill you want to protect, people who didn't look like you, think like you, or bow their heads when you told them to?" A sharp, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Celeste saw Mitchell shift nervously from the corner of her eye, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You're out of line, Dr. Carr," Holt spat, his voice dropping into a growl. "This is slander, and I won't let you smear my name." Celeste smiled coldly. "It's not slander if it's true, and you're not the only one with something to lose." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising with a mix of anger and clarity. "This isn't just about me. It's about the families you've pushed out of this town. It's about the people too afraid to speak up, knowing the consequences, but I'm not afraid." Holt moved suddenly, storming down from the platform and closing the space between them. The crowd gasped as he loomed over her, his face twisted with barely contained rage. "You think you can come here," he hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "and take me down? You don't know how this town works. You don't know who you're dealing with." Celeste didn't flinch. She tilted her head, meeting his glare with unshakable resolve. "The truth doesn't scare me, but it should scare you." "You think these people will believe you?" Holt said, his voice rising as he turned to gesture at the crowd. "This woman, this outsider, is trying to destroy everything we've built. Don't you see that she's—" "Enough!" Mitchell's voice rang out, cutting through Holt's tirade like a blade. All eyes turned to the young officer, who stood at the edge of the room with his fists clenched. "Sheriff Holt," Mitchell said, his voice trembling slightly but clear, "I think we've all heard enough." "What are you doing?" Holt snarled. Mitchell stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I've seen the reports, I've seen the evidence, and I can't look the other way anymore. You've been using your badge to intimidate people for years. It stops now." "You shut your mouth!" Holt shouted, his composure finally cracking. The room was chaos now. Shouts and gasps echoed off the walls, residents turning to one another with wide eyes. "You're done, Holt," Celeste said, her voice calm and unwavering despite the din. "This town deserves better, and it's going to get it." Before Holt could respond, a new voice boomed from the back of the room. "That's enough, Sheriff." Everyone turned to see two state troopers stepping inside, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. One of them carried a folder under his arm, while the other held a warrant. "Sheriff Holt," the taller trooper said, "we've got a warrant for your arrest. Step aside, please." The color drained from Holt's face. "You can't." "Yes, we can," the trooper replied curtly. He nodded toward Celeste. "Dr. Carr's evidence was sent to our office this morning. It paints a very clear picture." The crowd was silent now, as the officers stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. Holt stumbled back, his bravado crumbling as the troopers grabbed his arms. "This isn't over!" Holt roared, his voice echoing off the walls. "You'll regret this! You'll all regret this!" Celeste watched him being let out, his threats fading as the door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then someone in the back began to clap slowly at first, but soon others joined in, neighbors, friends, and strangers alike. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Mitchell let out a long breath beside her. "It's over," he said quietly. Celeste turned to him, her expression softening. "No, Mitchell, it's just beginning." Because she knew the truth. Taking Holt down was only the first step. There were others, powerful people who had enabled him, protected him, and she wouldn't stop until every last one of them was held accountable. As she stepped out of the town hall into the clearing rain, Celeste felt something shift. For the first time in a long time, Chester Hill didn't feel quite so small. The air in the courthouse hallway was thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Celeste's heels clicked against the polished floors as she strode with purpose, her mind racing through the events of the past 24 hours. A call from Mitchell that morning had changed everything. "There's something you need to see," he'd said, voice shaking. Now, as she gripped the manila folder in her hand, its contents damning, Celeste knew she was walking into a battle where only one of them would walk out intact. Her, or Officer Daniels. Mitchell stood waiting for her outside the sheriff's office. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he ran them over his uniform. "He doesn't know you're coming. I don't think he realizes how deep this goes." Celeste nodded, a fire in her eyes that seemed to steady him. "Good. Then he won't see it coming." Mitchell opened the door, and Celeste stepped inside. Officer Daniels sat behind his desk, his booted feet casually propped up on a stack of files. He didn't look up immediately, too engrossed in whatever was on his phone, but when he finally did, his smirk was as smug and poisonous as ever. "Well, well," Daniels drawled, dropping his feet with a heavy thud. "Dr. Carr didn't expect to see you in my office again so soon. Here to file another complaint that'll go nowhere?" Celeste ignored the venom in his tone, walking up to the desk and planting the folder in front of him. "I think you'll want to look at this." Daniels arched an eyebrow, glancing down at the folder like it was something foul. "I don't have time for—" "Make time," Celeste snapped, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Because when I walk out of here, your career and everything you've built will already be in freefall." The smirk faltered for just a second, replaced by something darker, something she recognized as fear. He masked it quickly, snatching the folder and flipping it open. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing, his eyes darting over the documents inside bank statements. Signed deals, evidence tying him to under-the-table purchases of properties from black families forced out of their homes under the guise of investigations. But the last page was the worst. Photos of Daniels meeting with developers, men who'd profited off every family he'd displaced. Daniels looked up slowly, his face a mask of anger, and something else, desperation. "Where did you get this?" Celeste leaned forward, her voice deadly calm. "You thought no one would find out, didn't you? You thought no one would connect the dots. You've spent years abusing your power, harassing families, pushing them out of their homes, and all to line your pockets. You don't enforce the law. Daniels, you sell it." Daniels slammed the folder shut, standing so abruptly his chair skidded back. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about." Celeste didn't back down an inch. "And so will everyone else when this hits the light of day." He leaned over the desk, trying to loom over her, his face red and twisted with fury. "Do you think anyone's going to listen to you? You're nothing in this town, you're an outsider. People like you—" "People like me," Celeste cut him off, her voice rising, "built this country. People like you only think you own it. But your time is up, Daniels." The words struck their mark. Daniels' eyes flared with something primal, a man who felt his grip on power slipping and couldn't bear it. He moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. Celeste could see the muscles in his jaw working, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have no idea what you're up against," Daniels hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so smart, digging through my business? You think you can waltz in here with some papers and ruin me?" "It's not just papers," Celeste said, her voice steady, despite the growing tension. "It's evidence, and it's enough to bury you." For a moment, Daniels seemed to waver, his bravado cracking. Then, just as quickly, it returned. He scoffed, stepping back with a bitter laugh. "You think you've won something here? You don't understand how this town works. People don't care. They'll believe what I tell them to believe." "Not this time," Celeste shot back. "Because I've already sent copies of this to the state attorney's office and a few choice reporters. By tomorrow, the whole town will know what you are." Daniels froze. The room seemed to shrink around them as the realization hit him. His eyes narrowed into slits, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You just made a big mistake." Celeste tilted her chin up, her expression unshakable. "The only mistake I made was thinking someone like you would ever change." The door creaked open suddenly, breaking the moment Mitchell stood in the doorway, his face tense. Behind him were two state officers, their expressions unreadable. "Officer Daniels," one of the troopers said, stepping into the room. "We need you to come with us." Daniels' head snapped toward them, his face a mask of fury. "You can't be serious. I'm the law in this town." "Not anymore," Mitchell said quietly. The state officers moved forward, one of them holding out a pair of handcuffs. Daniels stiffened, his chest heaving as though he might try to fight his way out of it. For a brief second, Celeste thought he might. But then the fight drained from him, his shoulders slumping as they snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. "This isn't over," he spat, his glare burning into Celeste. "You think this town will protect you? You have no idea what you've started." Celeste watched as they led him out of the office, his shouts echoing faintly down the hall. She let out a slow breath, her pulse still pounding in her ears. Mitchell stepped beside her, his expression uncertain. "Do you think he's right?" he asked quietly. "That people will turn on you?" Celeste turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe some will. But this isn't about being liked, Mitchell. It's about doing what's right." Mitchell nodded, though he looked unconvinced. "For what it's worth, you did the hard thing. Not many people would have had the guts to face him like that." Celeste gave him a small, tired smile. "When you've spent your whole life fighting to be seen, doing the right thing isn't bravery, it's survival." Mitchell looked like he wanted to say more, but the hallway outside had grown louder. Reporters were already gathering, their voices carrying through the building. The news of Daniel's arrest was spreading fast, and Celeste knew it was only the beginning. She glanced at the door one last time, the echo of Daniel's threats still lingering in her ears. He wasn't wrong. There would be pushback. People who had benefited from his corruption wouldn't let it go quietly. And there were others, people above Daniel's, who wouldn't hesitate to come after her for exposing him. But Celeste wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. "Come on," she said, turning toward Mitchell. "We've got more work to do." The morning after the arrest of Officer Daniels, Celeste sat in her modest office, the sound of her phone buzzing occasionally beside her, each notification adding weight to the growing storm outside. It had been a long night, press conferences, phone calls, meetings with the state attorney's office, but as the first light of dawn spilled into the room, Celeste felt an odd calm. The battle wasn't over, but a major victory had been won. Mitchell had stayed late to help coordinate a public statement, and now they were waiting for the fallout. Daniel's arrest had sent shockwaves through the town, but it was just the beginning. There would be more questions, more digging, and more people looking to cover up what had been exposed. Corruption in the town was deep, and Daniels was just one figurehead in a larger network. But Celeste couldn't dwell on the big picture yet. She had to focus on the immediate aftermath, the pressure that was building from all sides, the eyes on her, and the uncertain path ahead. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Mitchell stepped inside, holding a steaming cup of coffee. His usual somber expression was softened by a hint of relief. "How are you holding up?" he asked, setting the cup down on the edge of her desk. Celeste looked up from her laptop. Her eyes were tired, but the weight of the previous day seemed to have lifted just a little. "It feels surreal. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's a mistake, that Daniels will just walk back in here like nothing happened." "That's not going to happen," Mitchell said firmly, "not after everything that came to light." The town was already beginning to react to the news. Journalists were swarming the courthouse. Social media was ablaze with debates about Daniel's corruption, and former victims were speaking out. Celeste had expected backlash, but she hadn't anticipated the outpouring of support. People who had once been too afraid to speak now had a voice. They were telling their stories about the families Daniels had torn apart, the neighborhoods he had neglected, and the deals he had brokered behind closed doors. But it wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was about what had happened because of him. About the generations of people in this town who had suffered because the system had allowed corruption to flourish. Celeste had hoped for reform, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. The state attorney's office had already launched an investigation into the broader network of corruption that Daniels had been part of, and rumors swirled that more arrests were coming. Her role in all of this hadn't gone unnoticed either. The press had latched onto her as the driving force behind Daniel's downfall, and while that felt strange, uncomfortable even, she couldn't deny the significance of what had been set in motion. "I heard from the mayor's office this morning," Mitchell continued, leaning against the desk. "They're not happy, but they don't have much to stand on. Daniels was their golden boy. They'll have to deal with the fallout too." Celeste's jaw tightened. She wasn't naive enough to think this would be the end. The mayor and other figures who had benefited from Daniel's actions weren't going to let their empire crumble without a fight. "We can't stop now," she said quietly, meeting Mitchell's eyes. "There's still too much left to do. I've only exposed the tip of the iceberg." Mitchell nodded. "You're right. But what you've done is bigger than just this town. You've given people the courage to stand up, to speak out." Celeste smiled faintly. "I hope so." The phone buzzed again, interrupting the moment Celeste grabbed it, scanning the text message that had just arrived. It was from the state attorney's office, an official invitation for her to testify in front of a grand jury about what she'd uncovered. The request was a formality, but it felt like a clear sign that things were shifting. Celeste set the phone down with a deep breath. "I think we've reached a tipping point," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "But I can't do it alone. I'm going to need all the allies I can get." Mitchell's eyes softened. "You've got them. I'll do whatever it takes." The next few weeks passed in a blur of hearings, investigations, and press conferences. Daniels had been held in custody, and his trial was scheduled for early the next year. The entire town was in turmoil, with many people split between those who supported Celeste's actions and those who believed Daniels had been a necessary part of maintaining order. But Celeste had seen a shift. The voices that had once been silenced were now rising in unison, demanding accountability, not only for Daniels, but for everyone who had enabled his reign of corruption. Families whose homes had been threatened by the shady deals were taking legal action. They were reclaiming their property, their dignity, and their place in a town that had long forgotten them. And as Celeste stood before the grand jury, her testimony became the cornerstone of a sweeping investigation into the town's corrupt practices. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about systemic change, about breaking the chains that had held so many people in a cycle of oppression for decades. Months later, the town was still in a state of upheaval. Celeste had been offered opportunities to leave, to join political campaigns, to take a larger role in the state's reform efforts, but she hadn't taken any of them. She knew her fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courthouse where Daniels had once presided was now quieter, empty of the corruption that had permeated it for so long. Celeste stood outside it one afternoon, taking a moment to breathe in the cool air. It was the first time in weeks she felt like she could actually exhale without the weight of her mission pressing down on her. Mitchell walked up beside her, a coffee in hand. He was still with her, still fighting the fight. His support had become invaluable. They'd been through so much together. "You think things are going to change for good?" Mitchell asked, glancing over at her. Celeste smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. "Change takes time, but it's a start." Just then, the familiar hum of an approaching car drew their attention. Celeste turned, her eyes narrowing as the vehicle slowed to a stop in front of them. It was a sleek black SUV, with tinted windows. The door opened, and a man stepped out. A stranger, but one who seemed familiar in some unsettling way. "I guess we'll find out how much has changed," Celeste murmured. The man's gaze locked onto her as he approached, the air between them heavy with an unspoken tension. He extended his hand, and Celeste hesitated only a moment before accepting it. "Celeste Carr?" His voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "I've heard a lot about you." She didn't return his handshake immediately, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "Let's just say I represent some people who have an interest in seeing things change. Your way, you've done well to shake things up here, but this town, it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle." Celeste's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. The fight hadn't ended. It was only just beginning. As the man walked away, leaving behind a card with an address and time for a meeting, Celeste looked at Mitchell, her resolve hardening. She had expected challenges, but she hadn't anticipated this. "No going back now," she said quietly. Mitchell, ever the steady presence beside her, nodded. "We're just getting started,"